revealed how ministers asked the FA for a Brexit impact study on whether leaving the EU could stop the Premier League attracting top footballers. The government has asked football authorities to conduct their own Brexit impact studies on the effects leaving the EU will have on the sport. Two government ministers met with officials from the FA, the Premier League as well as other sporting bodies at a Sports Brexit Roundtable in January 2016 to discuss the impact of leaving the EU. However, the department wrote to the FA and the Premier League 18 months later in July 2017 asking them to supply a comprehensive analysis on the loss of freedom of movement on the game. The department asked whether the sporting organizations could respond in less than a fortnight, according to documents released to MailOnline. Premier League clubs have already seen a Brexit impact with the collapse in the price of sterling making foreign players more expensive. Worse for clubs, restrictions on freedom of movement could create significant problems in signing players from continental teams. Whereas players from outside the European Union face stringent tests on whether they are eligible for a work permit to sign for a British club. Under current rules, any footballer with an EU passport is entitled to play and live in the UK. One of the major tests for non-EU players is they must have played a certain number of games for their international team before being considered for a work permit. Strict sanctions could see a prohibition on Premier League clubs signing the best young talent, such as Arsenal's 2003 deal securing the services of 16-year-old Cesc Fabregas from the Barcelona Youth Academy. As well as making it difficult to sign players, any reduction in the quality of the matches could hit the value of TV rights, which are worth around £8.3 billion, some £3 billion of that coming from overseas broadcasters. A report by in 2015 found that the Premier League was worth £6.2 billion a year to UK economic output, £3.4 billion to UK GDP, while generating £2.4 billion in taxes to the Exchequer, supporting more than 100,000 jobs. According to documents seen by MailOnline, the department asked football authorities, according to heavily redacted documents released under the Freedom of Information Act by the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, DCMS, Ems Bradley, who is the senior minister in the department, and Ems Crouch, who has responsibility for sport, attended the Sports Brexit Roundtable on January 30, 2016. The department refused to release the names of those who attended the meeting, citing privacy concerns. The contents of the meeting have also been withheld after performing a public interest test, despite accepting that greater transparency makes government more accountable to the electorate and increases trust. On July 31, an official from the sport team at DCMS wrote to the Premier League on the FA seeking their assistance. According to the letter, the Home Office have announced that they will commission the Independent Migration Advisory Committee to carry out a detailed assessment of migration from the EU and have confirmed the government will consult with business in order to design a new immigration system that is aligned with a modern industrial strategy. The study will seek out the views of all sectors, including sport. We hope to have details of the timeline for implementation of the study in due course. While immigration is of course a Home Office area of responsibility, both DCMS ministers and officials are also keen to ensure that we can do all we can to support the case for sport. According to the department, greater transparency makes government more accountable to the electorate and increases trust. The desirability of citizens being confident that decisions are taken on the basis of the best available information, knowledge that the arguments relating to a debate will be released will in fact improve the quality of those arguments. Far from inhibiting the frank provision of advice, there might be circumstances where the prospect of disclosure would enhance the quality of advice. However, officials decided that withholding information on the key themes to emerge from the meeting will allow the government to inform the development of ongoing policy. According to the department, ministers and their officials need to be able to think through all the implications of different options. In particular, they need to be able to undertake rigorous and candid assessments of the risks to particular programs and projects. Good government depends on good decision-making, and this needs to be based on the best advice available and a full consideration of all the options, There may be a deterrent effect on external experts or stakeholders who might be reluctant to provide advice because it might be disclosed. West Ham's David Gold said in March following the triggering of Article 50, "The bottom line is that the Premier League is the greatest league in the world. It's a fantastic advert for Britain and for England. I know people talk about the wealth that's there, but these guys are on huge salaries and all the taxes going into the exchequer. Why would you stifle that? Why would you want that to change? The Premier League goes around the world and it's ever expanding. I don't see a government doing something potty to disturb that." Stoke City's chairman Peter Coates said, "We would expect footballers to be included in the exempt list. But we have to wait and see. I think the government's got more on its hands than worrying about the Premier League. They've no more idea than I have of what's going to happen. But hopefully football will find a way of looking after itself when it finally happens, whenever that will be. It could be years down the line." MailOnline has contacted the FA and the Premier League for a comment. Work permits. You don't have to be a citizen of a European Union country to move freely for work across the continent. Members of the European Economic Area, Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway, as well as Switzerland, have access to the EU's single market. It's harder if you don't have an EU or Swiss passport, particularly since more stringent eligibility requirements for British work permits for soccer players came into force a year ago. Only players from the top 50 FIFA nations are considered for work permits, with a sliding scale of appearances required, from 30% of games over 2 years for the 110 teams to 75% for 3150 teams. There is currently, however, an exemptions panel where clubs can argue why it is necessary to grant a visa to a player who doesn't meet the criteria. As for EU players, much will depend on the relationship Britain negotiates after a Brexit, and whether the free movement of EU citizens remains in place as part of a broader trade deal. Homegrown talent. The Football Association sees the potential for more homegrown players to gain first-team opportunities in the Premier League, and therefore boost the national team. But the Premier League will want to protect its status as the world's foremost and wealthiest domestic soccer competition. That's due just only to its competitiveness but the multinational makeup of squads. With some clubs also playing Europe in the Champions League and Europa League, they could argue that government needs to provide some form of easier access to players from the continent. Youth development. The impact of Brexit might not be seen for a decade, as some of the biggest enforced changes could be the makeup of club academies if clubs can no longer sign promising 16 to 18-year-olds from across Europe. That would have prevented Arsenal signing a 16-year-old Cesc Fabregas from Barcelona in 2003. Teenagers can be brought to England relatively cheaply for low compensation payouts to European teams rather than paying transfer fees. The hope is players break into the first team or become saleable assets. Clubs like Chelsea also have partner clubs in Europe, like Vitesse Arnhem in the Netherlands, to send promising players to gain experience. That might become more difficult,